I was folding laundry in our sunlit bedroom in Maplewood Heights when Marcus walked in with that peculiar smile, the one he wore when he thought he was being particularly clever. In his hand was a manila envelope, thick and official-looking, which he placed on our king-sized bed with the ceremony of someone presenting a birthday gift. "Happy anniversary, sweetheart," he said, that smile widening into something I'd never seen before. "I got you something special this year." Little did he know that by the time he finished explaining what was in that envelope, I'd be reaching for the phone to call my private investigator with news that would make his surprise look like child's play. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me paint you the picture of our life in Maplewood Heights, that picturesque suburb outside Denver where every lawn was manicured to perfection and every marriage looked like something out of a lifestyle magazine. We lived in a sprawling Tudor-style house on Elmbrook Drive, complete with the white picket fence that Marcus insisted would complete the American dream. For 12 years I had played my part to perfection, the supportive wife who quit her career in cybersecurity to focus on our family, the woman who could throw dinner parties that had his law firm colleagues' wives asking for my secret, the devoted partner who never questioned his late nights at the office or his weekend golf trips with clients. Marcus had met me during what I call my soft period, those few years in my late 20s when I thought maybe I could try being someone different, someone less driven, someone who could find fulfillment in being half of a couple rather than a complete person on her own. I had been working for Blackwood Security Solutions, the firm I'd built from nothing after leaving military intelligence, when I met him at a charity gala. He was charming, successful, and seemed genuinely interested in my work, at least initially. As our relationship progressed, I noticed how his eyes would glaze over when I talked about cybersecurity protocols, how he'd change the subject when I mentioned my clients, how he'd introduce me at social functions as my beautiful wife without ever mentioning what I actually did for a living. The transformation was gradual, like watching paint fade in the sun. First, it was just stepping back from day-to-day operations to spend more time together. Then, it was letting my business partner, Elena Rodriguez, handle more of the client meetings while I focused on back-end operations. Eventually, Marcus suggested that maybe it was time to think about starting a family, and wouldn't it be wonderful if I could be a full-time mother? "You're so nurturing, Sophia," he'd say, running his fingers through my hair. "You'd be an incredible mother. Besides, I make enough for both of us now. You've worked so hard for so long, don't you want to just rest?" Rest? As if building a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity firm from scratch was some kind of hobby I'd grown tired of. As if my expertise in digital forensics and intelligence analysis was just a phase I'd eventually outgrow. But love, or what I thought was love, has a way of making even the smartest women make questionable decisions. So I let Elena buy out my shares, or rather I let her think she was buying out my shares, while I quietly retained controlling interest through a series of shell companies that Marcus never bothered to investigate. I moved into our beautiful house in Maplewood Heights, and settled into the role of Marcus Chen's devoted wife. The irony wasn't lost on me that a woman who had made her career finding hidden digital assets and uncovering corporate espionage was now hiding her own capabilities from the man who shared her bed. But here's what Marcus never understood about intelligence work. Once you learn to see patterns, to notice discrepancies, to question what's presented versus what's actually happening, you can't just turn that off. So while I was arranging flowers and planning dinner parties, I was also noticing things. Small things, at first phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, new aftershave that he claimed was a gift from a client, credit card statements that didn't quite add up when I cross-referenced them with his claimed whereabouts. 18 months ago, those small discrepancies had reached a tipping point. Marcus had come home from what he called a bar association conference in Phoenix, with a tan that suggested significantly more pool time than one typically gets at legal seminars. More concerning was the photo I'd glimpsed on his phone of him and a stunning redhead at what was clearly an upscale restaurant, her hand resting intimately on his arm. When I'd asked about it casually, he'd claimed it was just networking with a fellow attorney from the conference. But the metadata on the photo, which he didn't realize I knew how to access, showed it had been taken in Cancun, not Phoenix, and on a Thursday when he'd told me he was in depositions all day. That was when I'd made the decision to dust off my old skills and conduct my own investigation. I'd contacted an old colleague from my military intelligence days, Jake Morrison, who now ran a private investigation firm in Seattle. Jake owed me a favor from our time in the service. I'd once helped him extract crucial intelligence from a corrupted hard drive that had saved his entire unit from walking into an ambush. When I'd called him 18 months ago, his first question wasn't about retainer fees or logistics. It was simply, how deep do you want me to dig, Soph? All the way to bedrock, I'd replied, and I'd meant it. So while Marcus thought he was married to a woman who spent her days organizing charity luncheons and perfecting her sourdough starter, he was actually living with someone who had complete access to his digital footprint, his financial records, his travel patterns, and his communication. Every business trip was verified, every client dinner was cross-referenced, every late night at the office was confirmed or debunked. I'd maintained my security clearance, updated my technical certifications annually, and kept my finger on the pulse of the cybersecurity world through Elena, all while playing the perfect suburban wife. The envelope Marcus had just placed on our bed represented what he thought was his masterstroke, a carefully planned exit strategy that would allow him to start fresh with his new life while keeping me dependent and compliant. He had no idea that I'd been watching, documenting and preparing for this moment for the better part of 2 years. As he stood there with that self-satisfied smile, waiting for my shock and devastation, I found myself thinking about the thick folder of evidence sitting in my home office safe, the liquid assets I'd been quietly accumulating, and the new cybersecurity contract I'd just signed under my maiden name that would net me more in 6 months than Marcus made in 2 years. The real surprise wasn't what was in his envelope. The real surprise was what he was about to discover about the woman he thought he knew. You see, Marcus thought he was married to Sophia Chen, the devoted stay-at-home wife who spent her days managing our household and volunteering at charity events. What he didn't know was that he was actually married to Sophia Blackwood, former military intelligence analyst, current owner of 3 successful cybersecurity consulting firms, and the woman who had been documenting his every move for the past 18 months. As I set down the laundry basket and stared at that envelope, memories flooded back of all the times I'd tried to share pieces of my real self with Marcus, only to watch his eyes glaze over with boredom or dismiss. Just 6 months ago, I'd attempted to tell him about the cybersecurity contract I'd quietly taken on, a 6-figure deal to help a Fortune 500 company recover from a ransomware attack. I'd been excited, proud even, to flex muscles I hadn't used in years. "That's nice, honey," he'd said without looking up from his phone, "but don't let it interfere with the Henderson dinner party next week. Patricia Henderson specifically requested your salmon recipe." I had stood there in our granite and marble kitchen, holding a contract worth more than his monthly salary, being reduced to a salmon recipe. That was the moment I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd become invisible in my own marriage, not seen as a partner, but as a service provider whose value was measured in dinner parties hosted and social obligations managed. The signs had been building for years, but I'd been too busy playing the perfect wife to recognize them for what they were. There was the time I'd mentioned wanting to attend a cybersecurity conference in Austin, only to have Marcus laugh and say, "What would you need that for? You haven't worked in tech for years." Never mind that I'd never actually stopped working, I'd just hidden it so well that even my own husband didn't know who I really was, or the time our neighbor, Sarah Kim, had mentioned at a block party that her medical practice's computer system had been compromised. I'd started to offer my expertise explaining that I had experience with healthcare cybersecurity protocols, when Marcus had smoothly interrupted. "Sophia's being modest," he'd said with that patronizing chuckle. "She reads a lot of tech articles online. Sarah, you really need professional help. I can refer you to someone who actually knows what they're doing." The humiliation had been swift and complete. Dr. Kim had nodded politely and changed the subject, while I'd stood there feeling like a fraud in my own skin. Later that night, when I'd tried to explain to Marcus that I actually did have the expertise to help Sarah, he'd patted my hand condescendingly. "I know you think you understand these things, sweetheart, but there's a difference between reading about technology and actually implementing it. Let's leave the tech stuff to the professionals, Okay. I'd wanted to scream that I wasn't just reading about technology, I was actively consulting for 3 major corporations under my maiden name, solving problems that stumped their internal IT department. But the words had died in my throat, strangled by 12 years of conditioning that had taught me my voice didn't matter in our marriage. Even our closest friends had bought into the narrative Marcus had constructed. At dinner parties, when conversation turned to careers and achievements, I would watch other couples discuss their professional lives with animated enthusiasm, while Marcus would beam proudly about his latest case victory. When someone inevitably asked what I did, he'd answer for me, "Sophia keeps our lives running smoothly. I don't know how she does it. The house, the social calendar, all those charity events. She's my secret weapon." Secret weapon, as if I were a particularly efficient household appliance rather than a woman with advanced degrees in computer science and cybersecurity, with military training that had prepared me for scenarios these suburban lawyers couldn't imagine in their worst nightmare. The isolation had crept in, gradually. Old colleagues from my military days had stopped calling when I never returned their messages about job opportunities. Former clients from Blackwood Security had eventually stopped reaching out when I repeatedly declined their invitations to industry events. Even Elena, my former business partner, had grown distant when I'd insisted our communications remain strictly professional and confidential. "You're disappearing, Soph," she'd told me during one of our rare coffee meetings 8 months ago. "I barely recognize you anymore." The Sophia I knew would never have let anyone diminish her like this. But I'd convinced myself it was temporary. Marriage was about compromise, I'd reasoned. Marcus was building his career at the law firm, and someone needed to maintain the home front. It wasn't permanent, just a phase, while we established our life together. Except 12 years had passed, and instead of growing into equal partners, we'd calcified into roles that left me feeling more like an employee than a wife. The breaking point had come 3 months ago during Marcus's firm's annual gala. I'd spent weeks coordinating our attendance, the dress, the reservations, the gift for the charity auction. At the event, I'd found myself in conversation with Jonathan Mills, one of the senior partners, who was lamenting the firm's recent cybersecurity breach. "Cost us nearly $200,000 in consulting fees," he'd said, shaking his head. "These hackers are getting more sophisticated every year. We need someone who really understands how they think." I'd opened my mouth to mention my background when Marcus had appeared at my elbow. "John, you don't want to get my wife started on computer stuff," he'd said with that familiar laugh. "She'll lecture you for hours about firewalls and encryption. Very passionate about her hobby, 12 years of military intelligence work, building a multi-million-dollar consulting firm, and maintaining security clearances that most people couldn't even qualify for, reduced to a hobby." Jonathan had smiled politely and excused himself, probably thinking Marcus was married to one of those suburban women who took online courses and fancied themselves experts. That night, lying awake beside my snoring husband, I'd made a decision. If Marcus wanted to pretend I was just a decorative housewife, then I'd let him continue believing that while I quietly rebuilt the professional life I'd allowed to atrophy. But this time, I'd do it smarter. This time, I'd document everything. The next morning, I'd called Elena and Jake Morrison. By the end of that week, I'd reactivated my security clearance, established new consulting contracts under my maiden name, and begun the most comprehensive background investigation of my own life that I'd ever conducted. If my marriage was going to end, and I was beginning to suspect it might, I wanted to be the one holding all the cards when it did. As I stared at the manila envelope on our bed, I realized that all those years of being dismissed, diminished, and made to feel invisible, had been preparing me for exactly this moment. Marcus thought he was delivering a devastating surprise to a helpless housewife, who would beg him not to leave. He had no idea he was about to go to war with a woman who had spent her career making powerful people's problems disappear, and who had 18 months of evidence, showing exactly what kind of man he really was. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. As I picked it up, my fingers automatically noting the expensive paper stock, the kind Marcus's firm used for their most important legal document. He was practically vibrating with excitement, that strange smile never leaving his face as he watched me examine the package. "Go ahead, open it," he urged, settling onto the edge of our bed like he was about to watch his favorite movie. "I've been planning this for months." The word hit me like a physical blow, though I kept my expression carefully neutral. As I broke the seal and slid out the contents, I already knew what I was going to find, but seeing it in black and white still sent a shock through my system. Divorce papers, meticulously prepared, professionally formatted, and completely one-sided in their terms. "Surprise," Marcus said, his voice filled with the kind of glee usually reserved for birthday parties. "I know it's unconventional, but I thought it would be easier this way. No drawn-out arguments, no messy emotional scenes, just a clean, civilized end to our marriage." I forced myself to scan the documents while he watched, though my training in intelligence analysis had already processed the key details in seconds. He was requesting full ownership of our house, both cars and the majority of our joint financial assets. In return, I would receive what he generously termed transitional support, essentially a modest monthly allowance for 2 years to help me get back on my feet. "You've thought of everything," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "I really have," he agreed, missing the edge in my tone entirely. "I even arranged for you to keep your car, the Honda, not the BMW. Let's be practical about this, Sophia. You haven't worked in years, and at your age starting over isn't going to be easy. This way you'll have time to figure out what you want to do with the rest of your life without any financial pressure." At my age, I was 42 years old, at the peak of my professional capabilities, and he was talking about me like I was some fragile elderly relative who needed to be managed. But what struck me most wasn't his condescension. I'd grown used to that over the years. It was his confidence. This wasn't a desperate man making a rash decision. This was someone who had planned meticulously, who believed he held all the power, who expected me to simply accept his terms and fade quietly into the background. "The papers are already prepared," he continued, pulling a pen from his shirt pocket with theatrical flourish. "All you need to do is sign, and we can both move forward with our lives. No lawyers, no court battles, no public embarrassment, just a simple, mature dissolution of a marriage that, let's face it, hasn't been working for either of us for a long time." Haven't been working for either of us, as if my feelings about our marriage had been consulted at any point in this process, as if he had any idea what I thought or felt about anything anymore. "Where will you be moving?" I asked, genuinely curious about the logistics of his master plan. His smile widened, and I caught a glimpse of something almost predatory in his expression. "Actually, I've decided to stay in Maplewood Heights. I love this neighborhood, and it makes sense for my career to maintain the same social connection. I've already spoken to a realtor about finding you something suitable in Riverside Commons. Nice little townhomes, very affordable, perfect for a single woman starting fresh." Riverside Commons. I knew the development, cookie-cutter townhomes 40 minutes from anywhere, designed for young couples just starting out, or older divorcees with limited options, the kind of place someone gets shuffled off to when they're no longer considered important enough for better accommodation. "And you'll be living here alone?" I pressed, though I already suspected the answer. Something flickered across his face, a micro-expression that most people would have missed, but one that my intelligence training had taught me to recognize. Guilt mixed with excitement, the look of someone who was trying very hard not to reveal a secret. "For now," he said carefully, "eventually I might consider other arrangements, but that's not something you need to worry about." Other arrangement. The phrase hung in the air between us, loaded with implications he thought I was too naive to understand, but I understood perfectly. This wasn't just a divorce, it was a calculated displacement, designed to remove me from his life so completely that there would be no awkwardness, no uncomfortable encounters, no inconvenient reminders of the wife he was discarding. That's when I heard it, the faint vibration of his phone against the nightstand. Marcus glanced at it reflexively, and I caught a glimpse of the notification preview. "Can't wait for tonight, finally time to celebrate." The sender's name was partially visible, Veronica M. Veronica Marla. I knew that name from the law firm's social functions, a stunning paralegal in her early 30s, who had joined Marcus's team about 2 years ago, blonde, ambitious, and always perfectly professional in public. I'd never given her much thought before, but suddenly a dozen small memories clicked into place with crystalline clarity. The way Marcus had started working later at the office, claiming that training new staff required extra attention. The mysterious client development dinners that seemed to happen with increasing frequency. The new cologne that had appeared in our bathroom 6 months ago, something expensive and distinctly different from the understated scent he'd worn for years. The weekend legal conferences that had become remarkably common, always in cities that seemed to specialize more in romantic getaways than continuing legal education. Veronica sends her regards, I assume, I said quietly. The color drained from Marcus's face so quickly I thought he might faint. He grabbed for his phone, but I'd already seen enough to confirm what I'd suspected. This wasn't just about him wanting a divorce. This was about him wanting to upgrade to a newer model without the messy complications of being honest about his motivations. I don't know what you're implying, he said, but his voice had lost that confident edge. Veronica is a colleague, a professional relationship. Is that what we're calling it? I asked, my tone still conversational. Professional relationship. How long has this particular professional relationship been going on, Marcus? He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window with the kind of nervous energy that suggested his carefully planned script was falling apart. You're being paranoid, Sophia. Just because I work with someone doesn't mean— 2 years, I interrupted softly. That's when she started at the firm, isn't it? Right around the time you suddenly developed such a passion for working late and attending conferences. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus had stopped pacing and was staring out the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. When he finally turned back to me, the mask of friendly condescension had slipped entirely, replaced by something colder and more calculating. Fine, he said flatly. Yes, Veronica and I have developed feelings for each other, but that's not why I want a divorce, Sophia. Our marriage has been over for years. You know that as well as I do. We're like roommates who happen to share a bed. No passion, no real connection, no future to build together. And Veronica offers all of those things. I asked. She understands my work, he said, warming to his theme. She's intellectually stimulating, professionally ambitious, excited about building something together. When I talk to her about my cases, about my career goals, she actually listens. She engages. She makes me feel like the man I want to be. The irony was breathtaking. He was describing exactly what I had tried to be for him for 12 years, before he'd systematically discouraged every attempt I'd made to engage with his professional life. But there was no point in arguing with his revisionist history. What mattered now was understanding the full scope of his deception. How long have you been planning this? I asked, gesturing to the divorce papers. The specifics? About 6 months, he admitted, apparently deciding that honesty was his best strategy now that his secret was out. But I've been thinking about it for longer. We're both still young enough to start over, Sophia, to find happiness with people who actually suit us. 6 months of plan, 6 months of secret meetings with lawyers, financial advisors, and real estate agents, while I'd been organizing his social calendar and managing his household. 6 months of lying to my face while he systematically prepared to erase me from his life. But what Marcus didn't realize was that while he'd been planning his exit strategy, I'd been conducting the most thorough investigation of my life, and the evidence I'd gathered over the past 18 months painted a very different picture of our marriage, his character, and his fitness to make unilateral decisions about our shared future. As I looked at him standing there, so confident in his control of the situation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the cold, focused clarity that had made me one of the military's most effective intelligence analysts. Marcus thought he was playing chess while I was still learning checkers. He had no idea that I'd been playing an entirely different game all along. I set the divorce papers down carefully on our nightstand, my movements deliberate and controlled. Marcus was watching me with the expectant look of someone waiting for tears, pleading, or perhaps angry accusation. Instead, I walked to our walk-in closet and knelt beside the built-in safe he'd never paid attention to, the one he assumed contained only my jewelry and important household documents. "What are you doing?" he asked, his confidence wavering slightly as I input the code. "Getting something I think you should see," I replied calmly, retrieving a thick folder from behind the jewelry boxes. It was labeled Project Griffin, a code name I'd borrowed from my military days, though Marcus wouldn't understand the ref. As I returned to our bedroom, Marcus was fidgeting with his phone, probably texting updates to Veronica about how smoothly his surprise was going. He looked up as I sat on the edge of our bed, folder in my lap, and for the first time since entering our room, his expression showed genuine uncertainty. "Marcus," I said quietly, "before we discuss your divorce papers, I think you should know exactly who you've been married to for the past 12 years. I opened the folder to reveal the first document, a copy of my military service record, complete with commendations, security clearance levels, and a brief summary of my role in several classified operations. Marcus's eyes widened as he recognized official Department of Defense letterhead. "You told me you did administrative work for the military," he said slowly, his voice carrying the first notes of confusion I'd heard from him all evening. "I told you I worked in intelligence analysis," I corrected. "You chose to interpret that as filing paperwork, because it made you more comfortable. But what I actually did was track down enemy operatives, uncover financial networks funding terrorist operations, and conduct digital forensics on some of the most sophisticated cybercrime organizations in the world." I turned to the next section, my civilian consulting contracts. The first was with Blackwood Security Solutions, the firm I'd built from nothing and had never actually sold, despite what Marcus believed. The financial statements showed annual revenues in the high seven figures, with my personal stake worth considerably more than he made in 5 years of practicing law. "I don't understand," Marcus said, reaching for the documents. "You sold your share of that company years ago. Elena bought you out when we got married." "Elena bought out my public shares," I explained patiently. "Through a series of shell companies and trust arrangements, I retained controlling interest in Blackwood Security while allowing her to run day-to-day operations. The company has been operating under my ultimate authority this entire time." His hands were shaking slightly as he flipped through the financial records. "This says you made $2.3 million last year alone. That's impossible. You haven't worked in—" "I've never stopped working, Marcus. I've simply worked under my maiden name and kept our professional lives separate. While you've been networking at golf courses and attending bar association dinners, I've been consulting for Fortune 500 companies, government agencies, and international corporations. The difference is that my clients value discretion, so my work doesn't require the kind of public recognition that seems so important to you." I turned to the next section, watching his face pale as he recognized bank statements from accounts he'd never seen before. Multiple accounts, in fact, spread across different institutions and investment portfolios that dwarfed our joint savings by orders of magnitude. "The house we're sitting in right now? I purchased it," I continued conversation. "The deed is in my name alone, something you might have noticed if you'd ever bothered to read the documents you signed during closing. The BMW you mentioned I couldn't keep. I bought that too. In fact, Marcus, nearly everything you consider ours was purchased with my income." But the financial records weren't the most damaging part of the folder. I turned to the section that had cost me the most to compile, 18 months of systematic documentation of Marcus's activities, compiled with the help of Jake Morrison and the full resources of a professional investigation firm. "Project Griffin," I explained, as Marcus stared at photographs of himself with Veronica at restaurants, hotels and vacation destinations across 3 different states, named after the mythological creature that was half eagle, half lion, because this investigation required both aerial surveillance and ground-level hunting. The photographs were devastating in their clarity and comprehensiveness. Marcus and Veronica holding hands at a resort in Aspen during what he'd claimed was a legal conference. The two of them checking into the Ritz-Carlton in Chicago during his supposed client development trip. Romantic dinners, intimate gestures and body language that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. "You've been having me followed," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been conducting due diligence," I corrected. "Something I should have done long before now." "Jake Morrison. You remember Jake from our wedding. Former Army intelligence, now runs Morrison Investigations. He's very thorough. Military training, you understand." I turned to the financial section of Marcus's activities, and this is where his face went from pale to ash. Credit card statements showing purchases he'd never mentioned. hotel bills charged to cards I wasn't supposed to know about. Most damaging of all, evidence of a joint bank account he'd opened with Veronica 8 months ago, funded with money he'd been systematically skimming from our joint household accounts. "You've been stealing from our marriage to fund your affair," I said matter of fact. "Roughly $47,000 over the past year, moved in small amounts that you probably thought I wouldn't notice. Unfortunately for you, financial analysis is exactly the kind of detail-oriented work I excel at." The final section of the folder contained the crown jewel of Jake's investigation: Marcus's communications, emails, text messages, and phone records that painted a picture of not just an affair, but a calculated plan to manipulate our divorce proceedings in his favor. "My personal favorite," I said, pulling out a printed email exchange, "is this conversation between you and Veronica from 3 months ago, where you discuss how to minimize Sophia's settlement expectations by emphasizing my lack of career prospects and financial dependence. Very touching, really." Marcus was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. "How did you? These are private communications. You can't just—" "I can't what?" I interrupted. "Investigate my own husband? Protect my own financial interests? Use the same intelligence-gathering skills I've been using professionally for the past 20 years? Marcus, everything in this folder was obtained through completely legal means. Jake has contacts throughout the private investigation industry, and more importantly, he has subpoena power for financial records when there's evidence of fraud." I closed the folder and leaned back against our headboard, studying his face. The confident, condescending man who'd walked into our bedroom an hour ago had been replaced by someone who looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "I don't understand how you hid all of this," he said finally. "We've been married for 12 years. "How did I not know?" "Because you never asked," I replied simply. "Because when I tried to tell you about my work, you dismissed it as a hobby. Because you were so convinced that you were the smart one, the successful one, the one with the real career, that it never occurred to you to question why I was so comfortable letting you handle all the big financial decisions. You assumed my compliance was ignorance, when it was actually strategy." I reached for the folder again and pulled out one final document, a comprehensive asset evaluation that Jake's firm had prepared, breaking down every aspect of our combined financial picture. "Here's what you didn't know when you prepared those divorce papers," I said, handing him the summary. "According to Colorado law, marital assets are divided equitably, but separate property owned before marriage or acquired through inheritance or gift remains with the original owner. The house, the cars, most of our investment portfolio, and several properties you don't even know about, all separate property purchased with my income from work you didn't think existed." Marcus was scanning the document, his face growing paler with each line. "This says your work. This can't be right. $3 million in assets, with an annual income that puts me in the top 2% of earners in Colorado," I confirmed. "While you've been working your way up to junior partner, making $180,000 a year, and thinking you were the financial powerhouse of our marriage." I stood up and walked to our window, looking out at the perfectly manicured neighborhood where Marcus had thought he would continue living with his young girlfriend, while I disappeared into subsidized housing 40 minutes away. "So here's how this is actually going to work," I said, turning back to face him. "You're going to take your little divorce papers and your joint bank account theft and your romantic getaways funded with marital assets, and you're going to call your attorney first thing Monday morning. You're going to tell him that you've reconsidered your position and would like to negotiate a fair and equitable settlement." "And if I don't?" Marcus asked, though his voice lacked any real defiance. I smiled then, the same calm professional smile I'd used in military briefings when explaining the consequences of enemy action. "Then Jake's investigation becomes Exhibit A in a very public divorce proceeding, where a judge gets to review 18 months of documented adultery, financial fraud, and attempted manipulation of court proceedings. Colorado is a no-fault divorce state, Marcus, but judges tend to take a dim view of spouses who lie under oath about their assets or attempt to defraud their partners." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Marcus's phone buzzing again. This time he didn't even glance at. "The choice is yours," I said quietly. "But you should know that either way, this marriage is over. The only question is whether you leave with your dignity and career intact, or whether Veronica gets to see exactly what kind of man she's been planning her future with. Marcus's phone buzzed a third time before he finally reached for it with trembling hands. I watched as he read Veronica's messages, his face cycling through emotions like a broken slideshow: guilt, panic, and something that looked remarkably like fear. "She's waiting for me," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "We had plans to celebrate tonight. She thinks you signed the papers already." "Of course she does," I replied, moving to sit in the leather armchair by our bedroom window, the one where I'd spent countless evenings reading while he worked late, or claimed to work late. "You probably told her I'd be grateful for your generous term, that I'd cry a little, maybe beg you to reconsider, but ultimately I'd sign because I had no other choice." He flinched at the accuracy of my assessment. "It wasn't supposed to be cruel, Sophia. I genuinely thought. I thought this would be easier for everyone. Easier for you," I correct. "More convenient. Less messy. No awkward explanations to colleagues about why you were cheating on your wife. No uncomfortable questions about your character from the partners at your firm." Marcus finally looked at me directly, and I saw something I'd never seen in our 12 years of marriage: genuine fear. Not the social anxiety he got before big presentations, or the mild stress of handling difficult clients, but the deep existential fear of someone who had just realized they'd catastrophically miscalculated. "What do you want from me?" he asked. It was such a simple question, but it hung in the air between us like a challenge. What did I want? For 12 years I'd wanted him to see me, to value me, to treat me as an equal partner rather than a convenient accessory. I'd wanted conversations about my work, respect for my intelligence, acknowledgement of my contributions to our life together. I'd wanted a marriage. But sitting there, looking at this man who had planned to discard me like outdated furniture, I realized that what I wanted now was something entirely different. "I want you to understand exactly what you've lost," I said finally. "And I want you to live with the consequences of treating me like I was disposable." I stood up and walked to our dresser, where I kept a small jewelry box that Marcus had never paid attention to. Inside, beneath my grandmother's pearl necklace, was a device that looked like an ordinary USB drive, but was actually something far more sophisticated: a portable hard drive, containing encrypted backups of every digital communication, financial record, and surveillance report from Project Griffin. "Jake gave me this 2 weeks ago," I explained, holding up the device. "Complete documentation of everything we've discovered about your activities, every hotel room, every restaurant, every lie you've told over the past 18 months. But more importantly, it contains evidence of financial fraud that could end your legal career." Marcus's face went gray. "You wouldn't what? Report criminal activity to the appropriate authorities?" "Marcus, you've been embezzling from our joint accounts to fund your affair. That's not just grounds for divorce. That's felony theft. The Colorado Bar Association takes a very dim view of attorneys who commit financial crimes." I sat back down, the drive still in my palm. "But here's the thing. I don't actually want to destroy your career. I don't want to see you disbarred or facing criminal charges. Despite everything you've done, you're still the man I loved for 12 years, and destroying you wouldn't give me any satisfaction." Hope flickered across his features, but I held up my hand before he could speak. "However," I continued, "what I will not tolerate is being treated like a victim or a fool. You walked in here thinking you held all the power, thinking you could dictate terms to me because you assumed I was helpless. That ends now." I opened my laptop, the one Marcus had always assumed I used for online shopping and social media, and pulled up a document I'd been drafting for the past month. It was a comprehensive divorce settlement proposal, prepared with the help of Rebecca Chen, no relation, despite sharing Marcus's surname, one of Denver's most respected family law attorneys. "This is what an equitable divorce actually looks like," I said, turning the screen so he could read. "You keep your 401k, your personal accounts, and your share of the furniture. I keep the house, both cars, my business assets, and my separate property investments. We split the joint savings account 50-50, minus the $47,000 you stole to fund your relationship with Veronica." Marcus's eyes widened as he scanned the terms. "This leaves me with almost nothing." "It leaves you with exactly what you brought to this marriage," I corrected. plus half of the genuine joint assets we accumulated together. The fact that you assumed you could take property I purchased with my own income shows how fundamentally you misunderstood our financial situation. I scrolled to the next section of the document. There's more. You have 30 days to move out of this house. I'm being generous with the timeline because I understand you'll need to find suitable housing, and I don't want to create unnecessary drama with our neighbors. Where am I supposed to go? He asked, his voice taking on a plaintive quality I'd never heard before. That's your problem to solve, I replied matter-of-factly. I assume Veronica has been planning for your eventual cohabitation, or perhaps one of those luxury apartments downtown that you can afford on a junior partner's salary. I turned the laptop back toward myself and opened another file, this one containing real estate listings I'd bookmarked over the past week. I took the liberty of researching housing options for you, I said, clicking through several listings. There are some lovely condos in the Riverside Commons development, the same area where you thought I should relocate. 2 bedrooms, modern appliances, very suitable for a professional couple just starting their life together. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Marcus stared at the screen showing the modest townhomes he'd so confidently assigned as my post-divorce destination, his face a study in dawning comprehension. You've been planning this, he said slowly, all of it. The investigation, the lawyer, the settlement terms. How long have you known? I've suspected for 2 years, I admitted, but I've had concrete proof for 18 months. Did you really think a woman with my background wouldn't notice when her husband started exhibiting classic signs of deceptive behavior? Changed routines, new expenses, altered communication patterns. These are the same red flags I've been trained to identify in foreign operatives and corporate espionage cases. I closed the laptop and leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. The difference is that when I uncover deception in my professional life, I report it immediately. When I uncovered it in my personal life, I decided to conduct a thorough investigation before taking action. I wanted to be absolutely certain about the scope of your betrayal before I decided how to respond. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, processing the complete reversal of everything he'd thought he knew about our situation. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. What if I refuse? What if I contest the settlement, fight for more favorable terms? I picked up the USB drive again, turning it over in my fingers like a talisman. Then Rebecca files a motion for discovery that includes all the evidence Jake collected. Your affair becomes part of the public record. Your theft of marital assets becomes a matter for the district attorney's office, and Veronica gets to explain to her colleagues at your firm why she was receiving transfers from a joint account belonging to a married partner. The implications hit him like a physical blow. His law firm prided itself on its reputation for ethical behavior. Partners were expected to maintain the highest standards of personal and professional conduct. A public scandal involving adultery and financial impropriety wouldn't just damage his career, it would end it. You have me completely cornered, he said, his voice hollow. Yes, I agreed simply. The question now is whether you're going to accept that reality gracefully, or whether you're going to force me to demonstrate just how thorough my documentation really is. Marcus looked around our bedroom, the space we'd shared for over a decade, filled with furniture I'd selected, artwork I'd chosen, and memories of a marriage that had apparently ended long before either of us had been willing to admit it. I need to call Veronica, he said finally. She's expecting me to come over with good news. I imagine she is, I replied. And what are you planning to tell her? He was quiet for another long moment, his fingers drumming against his thigh in a nervous rhythm I recognized from his most stressful court cases. The truth, he said finally, that I severely underestimated my wife, and that my surprise didn't go quite the way I'd planned. I nodded approvingly. That's a good start. You might also want to mention that your financial situation has changed significantly, so those plans you've been making about your future together might need some adjustment. As Marcus reached for his phone to call Veronica, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete control over my own destiny. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't reacting to his decisions or accommodating his preference. I was setting the terms, establishing the boundaries, and determining the outcome. It was, I realized, exactly how I should have been living all along. Marcus's phone call to Veronica was a masterclass in uncomfortable conversation. I remained in our bedroom, ostensibly organizing the documents from Project Griffin, but really listening to every word of his halting explanation from the hallway where he'd retreated for privacy. No, she didn't sign them, I heard him say, his voice strained. It's more complicated than we thought. No, Veronica, she's not helpless, she's actually, it's hard to explain over the phone. There was a long pause, presumably, while Veronica expressed her displeasure at this unexpected development. She knows about us, Marcus continued. She has photographs, financial records, everything, professional investigators, surveillance equipment. I had no idea she was capable of this level of preparation. Another pause, longer this time. What do you mean? What kind of person was I married to? She's a cybersecurity expert with military intelligence background. She owns multiple companies. She's worth millions. How was I supposed to know? She never acted like, she always seemed so. How do you explain to your mistress that the woman you've been portraying as a helpless housewife has just systematically dismantled your entire life plan? When he returned to our bedroom 20 minutes later, he looked like he'd aged 5 years in the course of a single phone conversation. She wants to meet with both of us, he said, avoiding my eyes, to discuss the situation like adults. I looked up from the laptop where I'd been reviewing the final details of my strategic withdrawal plan. That's not going to happen, Marcus. Why not? If we're all going to be dealing with the aftermath of this situation, wouldn't it make sense to— No, I interrupted firmly. Veronica is your problem now, not mine. I have no interest in mediating between you and your girlfriend about how to handle the consequences of your choice. I closed the laptop and stood up, moving to our shared closet where I began pulling out specific items, not packing, exactly, but gathering essentials with the efficiency of someone who had clearly thought through this process before. Where are you going? Marcus asked, watching me fold clothes into a small overnight bag. The Four Seasons downtown, I replied without hesitation. I've had a suite reserved for the past week, just in case tonight went the way I thought it might. Of course Marcus was staring at me like I was speaking a foreign language, which I suppose I was, the language of strategic planning and contingency preparation that had been second nature to me for 20 years, but had been invisible to him throughout our marriage. You can't just leave, he protested. We need to talk about logistics, about how we're going to handle the next few weeks, about what we tell people. I paused in my packing to look at him directly. Marcus, you came in here tonight with divorce papers, and expected me to sign them immediately, so you could start your new life without any messy complications. You don't get to suddenly develop an interest in collaborative decision-making now that things haven't gone your way. I resumed packing, adding my laptop, the Project Griffin files, and a few personal items that had significant meaning: my grandmother's jewelry, photographs from before our marriage, my military service medals that Marcus had never even known I'd kept. How long have you been planning this? He asked, gesturing helplessly at my efficient preparations. Which part? I asked. The investigation, 18 months, the legal strategy, 6 months, the hotel reservation, 1 week, the decision to leave tonight regardless of how you handled your surprise. About 3 hours ago, when I realized that even if you'd come in here with genuine remorse and a desire to work on our marriage, I wouldn't want to anymore. That last admission surprised me as much as it did him. I'd spent so many years trying to make our marriage work, trying to be the woman he wanted, trying to convince myself that love was enough to bridge the growing gap between who I was and who he needed me to be. But sitting in our bedroom, watching him fumble through the wreckage of his carefully laid plans, I realized that I didn't want to save our marriage anymore. I didn't want to go back to being invisible, even if he suddenly developed the capacity to see me. So this is it, Marcus asked. 12 years of marriage, and you're just walking away. You walked away first, I reminded him. You've been walking away for 2 years, Marcus. You just wanted me to stay in place while you figured out your exit strategy. I zipped up my overnight bag and moved to our dresser, where I retrieved several items from my jewelry box. Not just the expensive pieces, but the everyday rings and earrings I'd accumulated over the years. Everything that belonged to me, everything that represented who I was separate from him. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon to collect more of my things, I said, shouldering the bag. I'd prefer you not be here when I do, but if you must be, please keep the interaction brief and civil. What about our social commitments? He asked, desperate. The Harrisons' anniversary party next weekend, the firm's summer gala in July,
People are going to ask questions. I almost laughed at his priorities. His marriage was imploding, his financial future was in ruins, and he was worried about cocktail party awkwardness. You're a lawyer, Marcus. I'm sure you can figure out how to handle social explanations. Tell them we're taking some time apart to reassess our priorities. Tell them we've grown in different directions. Tell them whatever preserves your dignity. I honestly don't care anymore. I moved toward our bedroom door, then paused and turned back. But Marcus, don't lie about me anymore. Don't tell people I was dependent on you, or that I couldn't take care of myself, or that I needed your protection or guidance. Those days are over. Sophia, wait. His voice carried a note of genuine panic now. Can we slow this down, take some time to think about what we're doing here? I've been thinking about it for 18 months, I replied. I've run scenario analyses, consulted with lawyers, financial advisors and therapists. I've examined this situation from every possible angle. There's nothing left to think about. I pulled out my phone and showed him a contact entry I'd programmed earlier that week. This is Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a marriage counselor who specializes in high-conflict divorces. If you want to understand how we got to this point, if you want to process what went wrong, I'd recommend calling her, but don't call her thinking we're going to reconcile. That ship has sailed. Marcus stared at the contact information like it was a life preserver, which I supposed it was in a way. Will you go to counseling with me? He asked, not to save the marriage, but to help us both understand what happened. I considered his request carefully. Part of me wanted to refuse, to make a clean break and never look back, but another part of me, the part that had spent 12 years loving this man despite his flaws, thought maybe we both deserved some closure that went beyond legal documents and property division. I'll consider it, I said finally, after you've had some individual sessions to process your own role in this situation, after you've told Veronica the full truth about our financial circumstances, and let her decide if she's still interested in building a future with a man who will be starting over from almost nothing, after you've demonstrated that you can handle the practical aspects of our separation with maturity and honesty. And if I do all of that, then maybe we can have a conversation about how two people who once loved each other can end their marriage with dignity, I said. But Marcus, understand this: that conversation won't change the outcome. Our marriage is over. The only question is whether we end it with mutual respect or with the kind of bitterness that makes family gatherings awkward for the next 20 years. I reached for the door handle, then paused once more. Oh, and Marcus, you should probably call your parents before Veronica does. They're going to have questions about why their son's marriage imploded overnight, and you'll want to control that narrative yourself. His face went pale as he realized another layer of complications he hadn't considered. His parents had always been fond of me, had considered me a stabilizing influence on their ambitious but sometimes reckless son. They were going to want explanations that went beyond "we grew apart." 24 hours, I said as I opened our bedroom door. That's how long you have to start making calls and handling the immediate logistics. After that, people are going to start noticing that I'm not wearing my wedding ring anymore, and rumors have a way of taking on a life of their own.
I walked downstairs through the house I'd decorated, past the kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals, through the living room where we'd entertained countless guests who thought they were witnessing the perfect marriage. In the garage, I passed Marcus's BMW and climbed into my Honda, the car he'd so generously offered to let me keep in his original divorce proposal. As I drove through the familiar streets of Maplewood Heights toward downtown Denver, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete autonomy. For the first time in 12 years, I was going somewhere Marcus didn't know about, to do something he couldn't control or influence. I wasn't asking his permission, seeking his approval, or considering his preferences. I was simply leaving, on my own terms, with my own resources, toward a future I would design entirely for myself. The feeling was intoxicating. The Four-Season suite was exactly as I'd requested when I'd made the reservation a week earlier: corner unit, 23rd floor, panoramic views of the Denver skyline, and most importantly, complete privacy. I set my overnight bag on the king-sized bed and poured myself a glass of wine from the bottle of Cabernet I'd had delivered earlier. Then settled into the leather armchair by the floor-to-ceiling windows, to watch the city lights twinkle below. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since I'd left Maplewood Heights. Messages from Marcus that I had no intention of reading tonight. Whatever crisis management he was attempting could wait until morning. For the first time in 12 years, his problems were not my problem. I was reviewing emails from Elena about our Singapore expansion when my phone rang with a call from Jake Morrison. At 10:30 p.m. on a Saturday, this wasn't a social call. Sophia, Jake's voice carried the crisp urgency I remembered from our military days. We might have a problem. My monitoring systems are showing unusual activity on Marcus's digital accounts. He's making calls to some very expensive legal talent. I set down my wine glass and opened my laptop. How expensive? Kellerman, Pierce and Associates, Jake replied. Top-tier divorce litigation firms. Their specialty is high-net-worth cases where one spouse tries to hide assets from the other. They charge $500 an hour, and they don't take cases they don't think they can win. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, not panic, but the heightened awareness that had served me well in intelligence work. Marcus was adapting faster than I'd anticipated. What else? I asked, knowing Jake well enough to recognize there was more. Phone records show he's been in contact with a private investigation firm called Apex Security Solutions. They're not as sophisticated as my operation, but they're aggressive and they specialize in financial forensics. If Marcus is smart enough to point them in the right direction, they could uncover the same information about me that I gathered about him, I finished. How long do I have? Depends on how much he's willing to spend and how much he actually knows about your business operations. Jake's, if he just gives them your name and tells them to dig, it could take weeks to find anything substantial. But if he's figured out about Blackwood security, if he knows to look for shell companies and overseas accounts, days, not weeks, I said grimly. Jake, I need you to accelerate timeline on everything we discussed. Can you have the full documentation package ready for Rebecca Chen by Monday morning? Already done, he replied with satisfaction. I had Elena courier everything to Rebecca's office 3 hours ago. She'll have the complete file first thing Monday, including the financial forensics that prove Marcus's theft from your joint accounts. What about the other thing we discussed? I asked, referring to a conversation we'd had 2 weeks earlier about contingency plan. The evidence cache is secure, Jake confirmed. Multiple copies stored in different jurisdictions, encrypted and backed up to servers that would require federal warrants to access. Even if Marcus's new legal team manages to get some kind of emergency injunction against our investigation, the documentation is already beyond their reach. I felt some of the tension leave my shoulder. This was exactly why I'd insisted on working with professionals instead of trying to handle everything myself. Jake's military background had taught him the same lessons mine had. Always have a backup plan. Always assume your opponent will escalate. And always secure your assets before you reveal your position. There's something else, Jake continued. My sources at Apex Security say Marcus isn't working alone on this. Veronica Marlowe has her own attorney now, Patricia Vance, from Morrison and Associates. They're coordinating their legal strategies. That was an interesting development. It suggested that despite the shock of tonight's revelations, Marcus and Veronica were doubling down on their relationship rather than cutting their losses. It also meant I was potentially facing a two-front war instead of simply negotiating with my soon-to-be ex-husband. What's Patricia Vance's specialty? I asked. Employment law primarily, but she's also handled several high-profile cases involving workplace relationships. Word is that Veronica is claiming Marcus promised to support her financially during their relationship, and that she made career decisions based on those promises. I almost laughed at the audacity. Veronica was positioning herself as the injured party in this situation, the woman who'd been led astray by a married man's empty promises. It was actually quite clever from a legal standpoint. If she could demonstrate that Marcus had induced her to make financial sacrifices based on commitments he couldn't honor, she might have grounds for some kind of compensation claim. Let me guess, she's claiming she turned down other opportunities, limited her career advancement, maybe even relocated for Marcus's benefit. Exactly, Jake confirmed. And here's where it gets interesting. Patricia Vance has already filed preliminary paperwork requesting financial discovery on both you and Marcus. She's fishing for information about your combined assets to determine what Marcus might realistically be able to pay her client. This was the scenario I'd been hoping to avoid. A complex multi-party legal battle where everyone was trying to grab pieces of assets they thought belonged to someone else. Marcus's original divorce papers had been naive in their simplicity. This new development suggested his legal team had educated him about the reality of Colorado divorce law and the complications introduced by my previously hidden wealth. "Jake, I need you to do something for me," I said, making a decision that would accelerate our timeline considerably. "I want you to arrange a meeting with Marcus's new attorneys, not to negotiate, just to deliver a message." "What kind of message?" "The kind that makes it clear exactly what they're dealing with. Marcus still thinks this is about him versus me, with Veronica as a complicating factor. I want his legal team to understand that they're actually dealing with someone who has significantly more resources and experience than their client led them to believe." I opened my laptop and began pulling up files I'd kept in reserve: documentation of my security clearance, letters of recommendation from former military commanders, and case studies from some of my more high-profile cybersecurity consulting work. Not the financial information, which was already in Rebecca's hands, but the professional credentials that would make it clear Marcus's lawyers were not dealing with a typical suburban housewife. "You want to intimidate them," Jake said approvingly. "I want to educate them," I correct. "There's a difference between a scorched earth legal battle and a strategic demonstration of capability. If Marcus wants to escalate this situation, his attorneys should understand exactly what kind of opponent they're advising him to take on. And if they choose to escalate anyway." I looked out at the Denver skyline, thinking about the resources at my disposal, not just financial but professional networks built over 20 years of military and civilian intelligence work. Marcus might have connections in the legal community, but I had connections in places that could make his life very complicated if he chose to make this personal rather than keeping it professional. "Then we demonstrate why that would be a mistake," I said simply. After ending the call with Jake, I spent another hour reviewing the contingency plans we'd developed over the past 6 months. Every scenario we'd discussed was now in play: Marcus's legal escalation, Veronica's financial claims, potential challenges to my separate property status, and the possibility that this could become a protracted court battle rather than a negotiated settlement. But there was one element Marcus and his new legal team couldn't have anticipated, because it wasn't something that would show up in any financial discovery or background investigation. For the past 18 months, while I'd been documenting Marcus's affair and preparing for our divorce, I'd also been rebuilding my professional network and reputation within the cybersecurity industry. The Sophia Chen, who had been living quietly in Maplewood Heights for 12 years, was a carefully constructed persona, designed to give Marcus the wife he thought he wanted while allowing me to maintain my real capabilities in the background. But the Sophia Blackwood who would be representing herself in this divorce proceeding was someone else entirely, someone with professional relationships spanning 3 continents, with expertise that was genuinely valuable to major corporations and government agencies, and with resources that went far beyond simple financial assets. Tomorrow, Marcus would wake up in our house and begin making phone calls to family members and colleagues, trying to explain why his marriage had imploded overnight. He would meet with his expensive attorneys and try to convince them that his estranged wife was vulnerable to pressure and intimidation. What he didn't realize was that by escalating this situation beyond a simple divorce settlement, he had just declared war on someone who had spent her career winning wars that other people didn't even know were being fought. And unlike his amateur hour affair with Veronica, this was a conflict where I would be playing by rules he didn't even know existed. I poured myself another glass of wine and opened my secure communications app to send a message to Elena. It was time to accelerate some business plans that had been on the back burner, time to activate some professional relationships that had been dormant, and time to demonstrate exactly why underestimating Sophia Blackwood had been the biggest mistake of Marcus Chen's life. The real war was just beginning. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp Colorado sunshine that made downtown Denver look like a postcard. I'd slept better in the hotel than I had in our Maplewood Heights bedroom for months, waking refreshed and clear-headed at 6 a.m. without an alarm. For the first time in years, I wasn't planning my day around Marcus's schedule, his preferences or his needs. My first call was to Elena Rodriguez, who answered on the second ring despite the early hour. "Sophia, thank God," she said without preamble. "I've been worried sick since you texted me last night. Are you okay?" "Better than okay," I replied, settling into the suite's workspace with my laptop and coffee. "I'm free, and I'm ready to discuss that Singapore expansion we've been planning." There was a pause on Elena's end. "You mean the Blackwood security expansion? Sophia, you've been out of active operations for years. Are you sure you're ready to jump back into international cybersecurity consulting?" It was a fair question. Elena had been running the day-to-day operations of Blackwood Security while I'd maintained controlling interest from the shadows. She'd built an impressive client base and had grown the company's reputation significantly beyond what I'd established in the early years. The thought of stepping back into active leadership felt simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," I said honestly. "Elena, I've spent 12 years pretending to be someone I'm not, hiding my capabilities, diminishing myself to make someone else comfortable. I'm done with that. Permanently. What about the divorce proceedings? Won't you need to focus on the legal situation?" I pulled up the secure folder containing Rebecca Chen's preliminary strategy documents. "The legal situation is under control. Rebecca is handling the formal proceedings. Jake has secured all our evidence, and I have contingency plans for every scenario Marcus might attempt. But Elena, I need something more than just winning a divorce. I need to rebuild my professional identity." Over the next hour we discussed the Singapore opportunity in detail. 3 major financial institutions in Southeast Asia were seeking cybersecurity consulting for their digital transformation initiative. The contracts were worth $4.2 million collectively, with the potential for ongoing relationships that could establish Blackwood Security as a major player in the Asian market. "The Singapore client meetings are scheduled for next month," Elena said. "But Sophia, these aren't the kind of relationships you can manage remotely from Denver while dealing with a divorce. They expect face-to-face engagement, cultural sensitivity, and the kind of sustained attention that requires actually being present." "Then I'll be present," I said without hesitation. "I'll relocate to Singapore for as long as necessary to establish these relationships properly." Elena's silence suggested she was processing the implications of this decision. "You're talking about leaving the country while your divorce is pending?" "I'm talking about reclaiming my career while my soon-to-be ex-husband learns that trying to destroy me was a strategic error," I corrected. "Rebecca can handle the legal proceedings remotely if necessary. Colorado has provisions for international business travel during divorce proceedings, especially when one party has established professional obligations abroad." My second call was to Dr. Amanda Walsh, a forensic psychologist I'd worked with during several military intelligence cases. Amanda specialized in behavioral analysis and psychological profiling, skills that had proven invaluable when dealing with hostile foreign operatives. Now I needed her expertise for a different kind of adversary. "Sophia Blackwood," Amanda said warmly when she answered. "It's been too long. What brings you back to my professional world?" "I need a psychological profile of my soon-to-be ex-husband," I said directly. "Someone who's been systematically lying and manipulating for 2 years, who planned to discard me while stealing marital assets, and who's now escalating to expensive legal warfare when his original plan failed." Amanda's tone shifted to professional interest. "This is personal, not professional." "It's both," I admitted. "Marcus has hired Kellerman, Pierce and Associates, and is working with Veronica's attorney to challenge my financial assets. They're treating this like a standard high-net-worth divorce, where they can pressure the financially dependent spouse into an unfavorable settlement. They have no idea what they're actually dealing with. And you want to understand Marcus's psychological motivations so you can predict his next moves?" "Exactly. I can handle the legal and financial aspects, but I need to understand the man I was married to for 12 years. How did I miss the signs of someone capable of this level of calculated deception?" Amanda agreed to review the Project Griffin documentation and provide a comprehensive psychological assessment within 4. Her analysis would help me understand not just Marcus's likely strategies, but also the psychological factors that had enabled him to compartmentalize his life so effectively. My third call was to General Patricia Morrison, retired, who had been my commanding officer during my final assignment in military intelligence. Patricia now served on the boards of several major defense contractors,
and maintained extensive networks throughout the intelligence community. Sophia, Patricia's voice carried the authority that had made her one of the most respected officers of her generation. I heard through the grapevine that you might be returning to active consulting. Please tell me it's true. It's true. And I'm calling to ask if you have any connections at Kellerman, Pierce & Associates. My soon-to-be ex-husband has retained them for our divorce proceedings, and I'd like to understand what I'm dealing with. Patricia's laugh was sharp and knowing. Harold Kellerman was a JAG officer before he went into civilian practice. Competent attorney, but he's used to dealing with traditional military spouses, dependents who gave up careers to follow their husbands around various postings. He's going to be completely unprepared for someone with your background and capabilities. That's what I was hoping to hear. Sophia, if you're serious about returning to consulting, I have some opportunities you should consider. The Department of Homeland Security is looking for contractors with your specific skill set for a new cybersecurity initiative. The pay is excellent, the work is meaningful, and it would establish you as a primary contractor rather than a subcontractor. This was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been hoping would emerge. Federal contracting work would provide not just financial stability, but also professional credibility that would be virtually impossible for Marcus's legal team to challenge or diminish. Send me the details. I'm ready to submit proposals immediately. By midday, I had established the framework for a completely new professional life. Elena was preparing contracts for the Singapore expansion. Amanda was analyzing Marcus's psychological profile. Patricia was arranging introductions for federal contracting opportunities, and Rebecca was filing preliminary motions that would demonstrate to Marcus's attorneys exactly what kind of legal representation they were facing. But the most satisfying call of the day came from Jake Morrison at I delivered your message to Kellerman, Pierce & Associates this morning, he reported with obvious amusement. Harold Kellerman himself met with me for 30 minutes to review your professional credentials. And his reaction, let's just say he spent a lot of time asking questions about the scope of Marcus's knowledge regarding your background. When I explained that Marcus had been completely unaware of your military intelligence career, your security clearances, and your current business operations, Kellerman got very quiet very quickly. Did he say anything about their strategy going forward? He asked if you would be amenable to mediation rather than litigation. Apparently, after reviewing your file, he's not enthusiastic about taking someone with your resources and capabilities to court. He also asked several pointed questions about Marcus's truthfulness regarding the marital assets and whether his client might have misrepresented the situation. I smiled, imagining Harold Kellerman's growing realization that he'd been hired to represent a client who had fundamentally misunderstood both his opponent and his own position. What did you tell him? That you were a reasonable person who preferred negotiated solutions to adversarial proceedings, but that you were also someone who had spent her career neutralizing threats from hostile actors, and that how this situation developed would depend entirely on whether Marcus chose to continue treating you as an adversary or began treating you as an equal. Perfect. And what about Veronica's attorney? Patricia Vance requested a separate meeting for tomorrow. She wants to understand the financial reality of what Marcus can actually provide her client, given the new information about your separate property status. As I ended the call with Jake, I realized that in less than 48 hours, I had accomplished something that had taken Marcus months to plan and execute. I had shifted the entire dynamic of our divorce from his offensive strategy to my defensive superiority. More importantly, I had begun rebuilding the professional identity I'd abandoned 12 years ago, not as a retreat from my marriage, but as a foundation for the life I wanted to live going forward. That evening, as I reviewed contracts and proposals in my hotel, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my early days in the military, the deep satisfaction of operating at the peak of my capabilities, of being challenged intellectually and professionally, of building something meaningful that belonged entirely to me. Marcus had intended his surprise divorce papers to be the end of our story together. Instead, they had become the beginning of my story alone, and that story was going to be far more interesting than anything we had ever built together. Tuesday morning brought an emergency that shattered my carefully constructed calm. I was reviewing Singapore contract details over breakfast when my phone exploded with notifications, missed calls from Rebecca Chen, urgent texts from Jake Morrison, and an email marked priority from Elena. Rebecca reached me first, her usually composed voice tight with controlled anger. "Sophia, Marcus has filed for an emergency injunction against you," she said without preamble. "He's claiming you're attempting to hide assets by transferring them internationally, and requesting immediate freezing of all your business accounts." The coffee cup slipped from my hand, shattering against the hotel suite's marble floor. "On what ground?" "Fraudulent conveyance, potential money laundering, and violation of automatic stay provisions," Rebecca read from what sounded like legal documents. "He's also filed a motion claiming you're preparing to flee the jurisdiction to avoid divorce proceedings." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline that had always preceded high-stakes operations in the military. Marcus wasn't just escalating, he was launching a full-scale assault designed to destroy my professional reputation and financial stability simultaneously. "Rebecca, how is this possible? Every account, every business relationship, every asset transfer has been completely legal and properly documented. It's possible because Harold Kellerman is no longer representing Marcus," Rebecca replied grimly. "He fired them yesterday afternoon and hired someone much more aggressive, Cameron Cross from Cross & Associates, a litigation specialist who's known for scorched earth tactics and high-profile divorce."
Cameron Cross. I knew that name from news coverage of several celebrity divorce cases, where fortunes had been decimated and reputations destroyed. Cross's strategy was simple: file so many motions, make so many allegations, and create so much legal chaos that his opponents either capitulated from exhaustion or went bankrupt from legal fees. "When is the emergency hearing?" I asked. "Thursday morning." "Sophia, this is serious. Cross has somehow obtained detailed information about your Singapore contracts, your federal contracting discussions, and your recent business communications with Elena. Someone has been feeding him intelligence." The implications hit me like a physical blow. My phone calls, my email communications, possibly even my text messages had been compromised. Marcus or his new legal team had gained access to information that should have been secure. "Jake Morrison is on his way to your hotel," Rebecca continued. "Don't make any calls from your room phone, don't use the hotel's Wi-Fi, and don't discuss business matters in any space that could be monitored. We have to assume your communications have been compromised." I hung up and immediately began a security sweep of the hotel suite, using techniques I hadn't employed since my military days. Within 10 minutes I'd found them: 2 sophisticated listening devices, one hidden in the telephone base and another embedded in the complimentary tablet the hotel provided for guest services. The devices were professional grade, not the kind of equipment available to civilian investigators. Someone with serious resources and technical capabilities had been monitoring my conversations since I'd arrived at the Four Seasons. Jake arrived 20 minutes later, his face grim as he surveyed the electronic surveillance equipment I'd discovered. "Apex Security doesn't have this level of capability," he said, examining the devices with a magnifying glass. "This is military or law enforcement grade equipment. Sophia, Marcus has brought in some very serious players. Who would have access to this kind of technology? Private military contractors, former intelligence operatives, possibly even active federal agents working off the books." Jake replied. "Whoever Cross hired, they're treating this like a national security operation, rather than a domestic relations case." The reality of our situation was becoming clear. Marcus hadn't just escalated to aggressive divorce litigation, he'd somehow convinced powerful people that I represented a genuine threat that required the kind of surveillance typically reserved for foreign operatives or domestic terror. "Jake, I need to know how they're getting their information, and I need to know today. If they have access to my communications, they could sabotage the Singapore contracts, interfere with my federal security clearance, or worst of all, create grounds for criminal charges." "Already on it," Jake assured me. "I've brought in Sarah Chen, no relation to Marcus, from Defensive Cybersecurity. She specializes in counter-surveillance and digital forensics. If there's a leak in your communications, she'll find." Sarah arrived within the hour, a slight woman in her 30s, whose unassuming appearance belied her reputation as one of the most skilled cybersecurity investigators on the West Coast. She immediately began a comprehensive analysis of my devices, my accounts, and my digital footprint. "You've been compromised for at least 6 weeks," she announced after 2 hours of intensive investigation. "Someone gained access to your personal email account and has been monitoring all your communications. But here's the interesting part. The breach didn't come through external hacking. Someone with physical access to your devices installed keylogger software." My blood ran cold. Physical access to my devices? Someone who had regular access to your laptop, your phone, or your home computer. The software is sophisticated enough that it wouldn't be visible to casual users, but it's been recording every keystroke, every password, every communication you've made. Marcus, he'd been living in the same house, had access to all my devices, and certainly had the motivation to monitor my activities, but the technical sophistication suggested he hadn't done this alone. "Sarah, can you trace the software back to its source?" "Already working on it," she replied, her fingers flying over her laptop keyboard. The keylogger software was installed using a USB device that was connected to your home computer on multiple occasions over the past 2 months. The installation signature suggests someone with advanced technical training, not a civilian with retail spyware. The pieces of Marcus's strategy were becoming clear. He'd known about my business activities, my communication with Elena, my conversations with Jake, and my plans for international expansion because he'd been monitoring everything I'd done since the moment I'd started rebuilding my professional life. But if Marcus thought surveillance and legal warfare would intimidate me into submission, he'd forgotten who he was dealing with. I hadn't survived military intelligence operations by backing down from hostile actors with superior resources. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me," I said, making a decision that would fundamentally change the nature of our conflict. "I want you to trace every digital communication Marcus has made over the past 6 weeks. If he's been monitoring me, I want to know exactly who he's been talking to, who's helping him, and what their endgame actually is." "That's aggressive counter-surveillance," Sarah warned. "If we're caught, it could create serious legal problems." "We're already facing serious legal problems," I replied. "Marcus has declared war, brought in military-grade surveillance, and is attempting to destroy my professional reputation and financial stability. I'm not going to fight this defensively anymore." Over the next 4 hours, Sarah constructed a complete picture of Marcus's digital activities. The results were more alarming than I'd anticipated. "Marcus has been communicating with someone at the FBI's white-collar crime division," Sarah reported. "Email exchanges suggest he's convinced them that you're involved in international money laundering through your cybersecurity consulting work." "That's absurd," I said, but even as I spoke, I could see how Marcus might have constructed such a narrative. My offshore business accounts, my international clients, my military intelligence background. To someone unfamiliar with the cybersecurity industry, it could look suspicious. "There's more," Sarah continued. "He's also been in contact with someone at the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. They're discussing your Singapore contracts and suggesting that your sudden international business expansion is an attempt to move assets beyond the reach of U.S. courts." The scope of Marcus's betrayal was breathtaking. He wasn't just trying to win a divorce settlement. He was attempting to destroy my career by convincing federal law enforcement that I was a criminal. If he succeeded, I wouldn't just lose our marriage, I'd lose my security clearance, my business relationships, and potentially my freedom. "Jake," I said, turning to face both of them, "I need you to contact General Morrison immediately. If Marcus is making allegations to federal agencies, I need someone with credibility in the intelligence community to vouch for my background and reputation." "Already thought of that," Jake replied. "Patricia is flying in from Washington tonight. She's bringing documentation of your service record and letters of recommendation from former commanding officers. But Sophia, if Marcus has convinced the FBI to open an investigation, this has moved beyond divorce litigation into criminal exposure." As the sun set over Denver, I stood in my hotel suite surrounded by evidence of the most sophisticated character assassination I'd ever encountered. Marcus had transformed our personal conflict into a multi-agency federal investigation designed to destroy every aspect of my professional and financial life. But what Marcus had forgotten in his rush to escalate was that I'd spent my career dealing with hostile actors who had resources and capabilities far beyond anything a small-town lawyer could imagine. He'd brought sophisticated weapons to our conflict, but he'd never learned how to use them effectively. And unlike Marcus, I had 20 years of experience fighting wars where the stakes were considerably higher than asset division and alimony payment. The real battle was just beginning, and this time I wouldn't be fighting defensively. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of electric tension that preceded major military operations. I dressed carefully in a charcoal gray suit that conveyed authority without aggression, my military bearing evident in every measured movement as I prepared for what would either be my complete vindication or my professional destruction. General Patricia Morrison had arrived the previous evening carrying a briefcase full of classified documents that would, as she put it, remind certain federal agencies exactly who they're dealing with. Jake Morrison and Sarah Chen flanked me as we entered the Jefferson County Courthouse, while Rebecca Chen led our legal team with the confidence of someone holding an unbeatable hand. The courtroom was packed beyond anything I'd expected for a divorce hearing. Cameron Cross had clearly leaked details to the media, because I recognized several local reporters and what appeared to be federal agents in the gallery. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table looking haggard and nervous, while Veronica occupied a front row seat behind him, her face a study in barely controlled anxiety. Judge Catherine Williams called the hearing to order with the crisp authority of someone unimpressed by media attention or federal oversight. At 62, Judge Williams had a reputation for cutting through legal theatrics to focus on facts and evidence. "Mr. Cross," she began, "you've requested emergency relief based on allegations of asset hiding and potential flight risk. Present your evidence." Cameron Cross stood with theatrical confidence, launching into a presentation that painted me as an international criminal mastermind who had spent years constructing an elaborate financial conspiracy. He presented charts showing my business relationships, diagrams of my offshore accounts, and timelines of my recent international business activities. "Your Honor," Cross declared, gesturing dramatically at blown-up photographs of bank statements, "Ms. Chen has systematically constructed a network of shell companies and offshore accounts designed to hide marital assets from discovery. Her sudden acceleration of international business activities represents a clear attempt to move money beyond the reach of this court." He was good, I had to admit. Without context, the evidence he presented could appear damning to someone unfamiliar with international cybersecurity consulting. My Singapore contracts, my federal discussions, even my communications with Elena, were presented as evidence of suspicious activity, rather than legitimate business operation. Chen's background in military intelligence and her current security clearances suggest capabilities for financial manipulation that go far beyond normal civilian operations. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit has expressed concerns about the timing and scope of her recent activity. When Cross finished his presentation, the courtroom was silent, except for the scratch of reporters' pens. Marcus was staring at me with something that looked like triumph, clearly believing his new attorney had delivered a devastating blow. Judge Williams turned to Rebecca with raised eyebrows. "Ms. Chen, your response." Rebecca stood slowly, carrying herself with the calm assurance of someone about to demolish a house of cards. "Your Honor, Ms. Cross's presentation is a masterpiece of innuendo and misdirection, but it suffers from one fatal flaw. Every single allegation he's made is contradicted by documentary evidence that we're prepared to present today." She gestured to Sarah Chen, who began setting up a laptop and projection system with military precision. Sarah Chen is one of the nation's leading cybersecurity forensics experts, Rebecca explained. Her investigation has revealed the true nature of the surveillance and manipulation that Ms. Cross's client has been conducting against my client for the past 6 weeks. What followed was a systematic deconstruction of Marcus's entire strategy. Sarah presented evidence of the keylogger software, the illegal surveillance equipment, and the comprehensive monitoring of my communication. More damaging still, She had traced Marcus's contacts with federal agencies and documented how he had deliberately misrepresented my business activities to trigger criminal investigation. Chen has been conducting illegal surveillance of his estranged wife, Rebecca explained, as Sarah displayed email exchanges on the courtroom's projection screen. He installed keystroke monitoring software, placed professional-grade listening devices in her hotel room, and systematically violated her privacy to gain advantage in divorce proceedings. Judge Williams leaned forward, her expression growing increasingly severe as the evidence mounted. But the most serious aspect of Mr. Chen's conduct, Rebecca continued, is his deliberate attempt to manipulate federal law enforcement agencies by providing misleading information about his wife's legitimate business activity. Sarah clicked to the next slide, showing email exchanges between Marcus and FBI contacts. The messages revealed Marcus's systematic campaign to convince federal agents that my international business expansion was evidence of money laundering, rather than the normal operations of a cybersecurity consulting firm. Chen has weaponized federal law enforcement against his estranged wife in an attempt to gain advantage in domestic relations proceedings. This represents not just a violation of my client's civil rights, but potentially criminal abuse of federal resources. Judge Williams's expression had shifted from skeptical attention to barely controlled outrage. Mr. Cross, are you aware that your client has been conducting illegal surveillance? Cross was on his feet immediately, his earlier confidence evaporated. Your Honor, my client was simply gathering evidence of potential financial impropriety, using illegal wiretapping equipment. Judge Williams interrupted. Mr. Cross, I've reviewed the evidence Ms. Chen has presented. The surveillance devices your client employed require federal licenses to operate. Does Mr. Chen have such licenses? The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus was staring at his attorney with growing panic, clearly realizing that his strategy had not only failed but had potentially exposed him to criminal liability. I thought not, Judge Williams continued. Cross, are you also aware that providing false information to federal law enforcement agencies constitutes a federal crime? But Rebecca wasn't finished. She gestured to General Morrison, who stood and approached the bench with a folder bearing official Pentagon seal. Your Honor, Rebecca said, General Morrison has served as character witness for Mrs. Chen, and has brought official documentation from the Department of Defense regarding my client's service record and current security clearance status. General Morrison's presence transformed the courtroom atmosphere completely. Even the federal agents in the gallery straightened in their seats as she presented her credentials and began speaking in the clipped, authoritative tone that had made her a legend in intelligence circles. Your Honor, General Morrison began, Sophia Blackwood Chen served with distinction in military intelligence for 8 years and has maintained active security clearances for over 20 years. The allegations made against her are not only false, but demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of how cybersecurity consulting operates in the modern international environment. She opened the Pentagon folder and extracted several documents. These are letters of recommendation from former commanding officers, documentation of Mrs. Chen's exemplary service record, and most importantly, verification from the Department of Defense that all of her business activities have been reviewed and approved by appropriate security agents. Judge Williams reviewed the documents carefully, her expression growing more severe with each page. General Morrison, she said finally, are you stating for the record that Mrs. Chen's business activities have been cleared by federal security agencies? Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Chen's Singapore contracts were specifically reviewed by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and found to pose no security concerns. Her federal contracting discussions have been conducted through proper channels with full security clearance verification. There is no basis whatsoever for the allegations Mr. Chen has made to federal law enforcement. The courtroom erupted in whispers as reporters realized they were witnessing not just a divorce hearing, but the complete demolition of what appeared to be a sophisticated character assassination campaign. Judge Williams called for order, then turned her attention back to Cameron Cross and Marcus. Mr. Cross, she said, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority, your client's emergency motion is not only denied, it appears to have been filed under false pretenses.
I'm ordering an immediate investigation into Mr. Chen's conduct, including his use of illegal surveillance equipment and his provision of false information to federal agencies. She turned to Rebecca. Ms. Chen, I'm granting a restraining order prohibiting any further surveillance or harassment of your client. I'm also ordering Mr. Chen to turn over all surveillance equipment and recorded materials to court-appointed officials for destruction. The transformation was complete. In less than 2 hours, Marcus had gone from confident prosecutor to potential criminal defendant. Cameron Cross was frantically whispering with his client, clearly trying to assess their legal exposure and plan damage control, but Judge Williams wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, given the egregious nature of Mr. Chen's conduct and his deliberate attempt to manipulate federal resources, I'm referring this matter to the Colorado Bar Association for disciplinary review. Chen's fitness to practice law will be evaluated in light of his actions during these proceedings. As court officers began approaching Marcus to collect the surveillance equipment, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my military days: the deep satisfaction of watching a carefully planned operation succeed completely. Marcus's surprise divorce papers had been intended to destroy my life quietly and efficiently. Instead, they had triggered a series of events that had not only secured my financial independence, but had also exposed his true character to federal law enforcement, the legal community, and anyone else who might have been fooled by his carefully constructed facade. The hunter had become the hunted, and justice, for once, was swift and uncompromising. 6 months later, I stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corner office on the 32nd floor of the Republic Plaza building in downtown Denver, watching the morning sun paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and amber. The view was spectacular, but what truly took my breath away was the bronze nameplate on my mahogany desk that read Sophia Blackwood, CEO, Blackwood Global Security Solutions. The transformation had been swift and comprehensive. Within weeks of the courtroom vindication, 3 major developments had reshaped my professional landscape entirely. The Singapore contracts, far from being cancelled due to Marcus's federal interference, had actually expanded when the clients learned about my security clearance level and military background. What had started as a $4.2 million consulting arrangement had evolved into a $12 million strategic partnership spanning 3 countries. Elena knocked on my office door, carrying the morning briefing folder that had become our daily ritual since I'd returned to active leadership of the company. The Washington Post wants to interview you for their Women in Cybersecurity feature, she announced, settling into one of the leather chairs facing my desk. They're particularly interested in how someone rebuilds a career after what they're calling one of the most vindictive divorce cases in Colorado legal history. I smiled, remembering how different my life had been just 6 months ago. What's our media strategy this month? Selective engagement, Elena replied, consulting her notes. The Harvard Business Review article comes out next week, focusing on your international expansion model. Forbes is running their piece on government contracting opportunities for veteran-owned businesses in their November issue. And the keynote speech for the International Cybersecurity Summit in Zurich is scheduled for December. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had attempted to destroy my reputation by claiming I was hiding my professional capability. The resulting investigation had not only cleared my name, but had actually elevated my profile to levels I'd never achieved during my original career in cybersecurity. What about the federal contracting situation? I asked. Even better than we hoped, Elena said with satisfaction. The Department of Homeland Security signed the final contracts yesterday, $24 million over 3 years for cybersecurity assessment and threat analysis. General Morrison says it's the largest initial contract ever awarded to a veteran-owned cybersecurity firm. I leaned back in my chair, still adjusting to the reality of my transformed circumstances. The federal contracting work alone would establish Blackwood Global Security as a major player in government cybersecurity, while the international expansion had created opportunities I'd never imagined during my early career. Any word on the Colorado Bar Association's decision regarding Mark? I asked. Elena's expression grew more serious. Rebecca called this morning. The disciplinary board completed their investigation. Marcus is facing a 2-year suspension of his law license, plus mandatory retraining on legal ethics, before he can apply for reinstatement. The news should have given me satisfaction, but instead I felt only a distant sadness for the man I'd once loved. Marcus's attempt to destroy me had ultimately destroyed his own career, his relationship with Veronica, and his standing in the legal community. The house in Maplewood Heights had been sold to pay his legal fees, and according to mutual acquaintances, he was now working as a paralegal for a small firm while trying to rebuild his reputation. "There's something else," Elena continued, her tone shifting to excitement. Jake Morrison called with an update on the Apex security situation.
The investigation into Marcus's surveillance activities had revealed far more than illegal wiretapping. Apex Security, the firm Marcus had hired to investigate me, had been conducting similar operations for other clients involved in high-stakes divorces. The FBI's investigation had uncovered a network of private investigators, attorneys, and technology specialists who specialized in using surveillance and intimidation tactics to gain advantage in family court proceedings. The federal indictments were unsealed yesterday, Elena reported. 14 people charged with conspiracy, racketeering, and violation of federal surveillance laws. Marcus isn't being charged criminally, but he's a key witness in the prosecution case. The scope of what we'd uncovered was staggering. Marcus's attempt to spy on me had inadvertently exposed a criminal enterprise that had been operating for years, destroying lives and corrupting legal proceedings across multiple states. My assistant's voice came through the intercom, interrupting our discussion. "Blackwood, you have a call from Singapore. Mr. Chen from Pacific Financial Holdings is online too." I picked up the phone, switching to the Mandarin I'd been studying intensively for the past 4 months. The conversation lasted 20 minutes and resulted in an additional $8 million contract extension for the following year. "Your language skills are improving rapidly," Elena observed when I hung up. "Immersion learning," I replied. "I'll be spending 2 weeks per month in Singapore for the next year, so fluency isn't optional." This was perhaps the most profound change in my life, the rediscovery of my capacity for growth and challenge. For 12 years I'd allowed my world to shrink to accommodate Marcus's preferences and social expectations. Now, at 42, I was learning new languages, traveling internationally for business, and operating at a level of professional complexity that would have intimidated my younger self. "Speaking of Singapore," Elena said, "David Kim from the Minister of Defense's office called about the regional cybersecurity initiative they're proposing. They want Blackwood Global to lead a consortium of firms providing security assessment for Southeast Asian financial institutions. The opportunity Elena described would position our company as the primary cybersecurity contractor for an entire region. The financial implications were enormous, but more importantly, it would establish a professional legacy that went far beyond anything I'd originally dreamed possible." "Set up the preliminary meeting," I decided. "But Elena, I want our proposal to include training and capability transfer for local firms. We're not just going to parachute in and extract profits. We're going to build sustainable cybersecurity capacity in the region." Elena nodded approvingly. This approach had become our signature strategy, distinguishing Blackwood Global from larger consulting firms that focused purely on short-term contracts. As Elena left to coordinate the Singapore response, I turned back to the windows overlooking Denver. The city where I'd spent 12 years feeling invisible and undervalued now offered a panoramic view of possibilities I was just beginning to explore. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the marriage counselor I'd mentioned to Marcus months ago. We'd ended up having several sessions together, not to repair our marriage, but to understand how two intelligent people had created such a dysfunctional dynamic. "Saw the Forbes article preview online," Jennifer's message read. "Proud of how you've rebuilt your life. Coffee next week to celebrate." I typed back quickly. "Absolutely. And Jennifer, thank you for helping me understand that losing myself wasn't a requirement for loving someone else." The afternoon brought a steady stream of meetings, strategic planning sessions with department heads, contract reviews for new international clients, and a video conference with potential investors interested in funding our expansion into European market. At 6 p.m., when the office had finally quieted, I opened my laptop to review the presentation I'd been preparing for the Zurich summit. The topic was cybersecurity leadership in crisis, how personal adversity can drive professional innovation. The presentation told the story of how a devastating personal betrayal had forced me to rediscover professional capabilities I'd allowed to atrophy, how legal warfare had connected me with opportunities I'd never known existed, and how the attempt to destroy my reputation had ultimately elevated it to unprecedented level. But the core message was simpler, that the most profound transformations often emerge from the moments when we're forced to choose between accepting someone else's diminished version of ourselves or fighting to reclaim our authentic capability. As I saved the presentation and prepared to leave the office, I realized that Marcus's surprise divorce papers had given me something far more valuable than he'd intended to take away. They'd given me back myself, not the woman I'd been at 30 when I'd compromised my identity for love, but the woman I was becoming at 42 with 2 decades of experience and unlimited possibilities ahead. The surprise, it turned out, had indeed been mine, but it wasn't the revenge I'd initially imagined. It was the discovery that the life I'd built while hiding my true self had been nothing compared to the life I could build while embracing it completely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new growth, but tonight, for the first time in 12 years, I was exactly where I belonged, at the center of my own story, writing the next chapter entirely on my own terms. 1 year to the day after Marcus had walked into our bedroom with divorce papers, I stood in the lobby of the Grand Hyatt Singapore, watching Elena coordinate the final preparations for the Southeast Asian Cybersecurity Summit. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on me. Exactly 65 days since the moment that had seemed like the end of my world, I was about to deliver the opening keynote address to over 800 cybersecurity professionals from 15 countries. The hotel lobby buzzed with conversation in multiple languages, as delegates arrived for what industry publications were calling the most significant cybersecurity conference in Asian history. My company, Blackwood Global Security Solutions, was not just attending. We were the primary sponsor, and my presentation would set the tone for 3 days of discussions about the future of international cyber defense. Sophia, the Singapore Minister of Defense, would like a few minutes before your speech, Elena said, approaching with her trademark efficiency. And the Prime Minister's cybersecurity advisor specifically requested an introduction. Apparently, your Harvard Business Review article has been required reading for their entire department. I adjusted the collar of my navy silk blazer, custom tailored in Hong Kong during my last business trip, and checked my watch. In 30 minutes, I would step onto a stage and address an audience that included some of the most brilliant minds in global cybersecurity. The presentation I'd prepared would launch initiatives worth over $200 million in regional contracts and establish Blackwood Global as the premier cybersecurity consultancy in Southeast Asia. But first, I had something personal to attend to. Elena, give me 10 minutes. There's a call I need to make. I stepped onto the hotel's executive terrace, overlooking Singapore's spectacular skyline, and dialed a number I'd memorized but never used. After 4 rings, a familiar voice answered. Veronica Mar. She sounded tired, older than the confident woman I remembered from Marcus's law firm's social event. According to mutual acquaintances, Veronica had lost her paralegal position when the Apex security scandal broke, and she'd struggled to find work in Denver's legal community after her relationship with Marcus became public knowledge. Veronica, this is Sophia Blackwood, I said, using my maiden name professionally now. I'm calling because I wanted you to hear something directly from me before you read about it in the newspapers. There was a long pause. Sophia, I didn't expect to ever hear from you again. I'm in Singapore right now, about to announce a joint venture that will make Blackwood Global one of the largest cybersecurity firms in Asia, I said calmly. But before I do that, I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry for what happened to your career because of Marcus's actions. You're sorry? Veronica's voice carried genuine confusion. Sophia, I helped destroy your marriage. I participated in Marcus's lies and manipulation. Why would you be calling to apologize to me? I looked out at Singapore's Marina Bay, thinking about the 18 months since that devastating night when my world had imploded and rebuilt itself into something I'd never imagined possible. Because you were as much a victim of Marcus's deception as I was, I said honestly. He convinced you that I was just a housewife who would quietly disappear when it became convenient. He promised you a life together that he was never actually in a position to deliver, and when his plan failed, you lost everything too. Veronica was quiet for so long I thought the connection had been lost. I've been working as a legal secretary in Boulder, she said finally. Nobody in Denver will hire me. Marcus told me you were just this sweet, naive woman who didn't understand business or money. He said you'd be grateful for the divorce settlement because you couldn't take care of yourself. I had no idea who you really were. Marcus believed his own narrative about me because it made him feel more important, I replied. But Veronica, you have a law degree from C. You have skills and capabilities that aren't dependent on anyone else's opinion of your worth. Don't let Marcus's lies define what you think you can accomplish. Why are you telling me this? I considered her question carefully. Why was I calling Veronica on one of the most important days of my professional life? What did I hope to accomplish? Because 18 months ago, someone told me that the best weapon in any battle is the one your opponent doesn't know you have. But I've learned something more important since then. The best victory is the one that doesn't require weapons at all. It's the one where you simply become so successful that your opponent's actions become irrelevant. I paused, watching a cargo ship navigate the busy harbor below. Veronica, I'm going to have Elena send you some information about legal positions with international corporations that have offices in Singapore, Hong Kong and Tokyo, companies that value competent legal professionals and don't care about Denver gossip. If you're interested in starting over somewhere that your past with Marcus doesn't matter, there are opportunities available. You would do that, after everything that happened? I would do that, because carrying anger and resentment is exhausting, I said honestly. I'd rather use that energy to build something positive instead of dwelling on something destructive. When I ended the call, I felt a lightness I hadn't expected. The conversation with Veronica had closed a circle I hadn't realized was still open, the last remaining emotional connection to the life I'd left behind in Maplewood Heights. Elena found me on the terrace 20 minutes later. Sophia, it's time. Are you ready? I gathered my notes and followed her toward the conference center, where 800 of the world's most accomplished cybersecurity professionals were waiting to hear about the future of international cyber defense. As we walked through the hotel's opulent corridors, I caught glimpses of myself in the mirrored walls, a confident woman in her early 40s, moving with purpose and authority toward a stage where she would announce initiatives that would reshape an entire industry. The woman in the mirror bore little resemblance to the person who had been folding laundry in a suburban bedroom when her husband delivered his surprise divorce papers. This woman carried herself like someone accustomed to boardrooms and international negotiations, someone whose opinions mattered and whose expertise was valued at the highest levels of government and industry. As I waited in the wings for my introduction, I thought about Marcus's original divorce papers, the documents that had been designed to reduce me to a financial dependent, grateful for whatever scraps he chose to leave behind. Those papers now sat in Rebecca Chen's legal files as evidence in what had become a landmark case study in domestic surveillance and legal misconduct. Marcus himself had become something of a cautionary tale in Colorado legal circles. His 2-year suspension from practicing law had been widely covered in professional publications, and his testimony in the Apex security trials had revealed the extent to which some attorneys would go to gain advantage in family court proceedings. The last I'd heard, he was working as a compliance officer for a small insurance company, trying to rebuild both his reputation and his finances from essentially nothing. Ladies and gentlemen, the conference moderator announced from the stage, please welcome the founder and CEO of Blackwood Global Security Solutions, keynote speaker Sophia Blackwood. I walked onto the stage to sustained applause, looking out at an audience that represented the pinnacle of achievement in my chosen field. These were people who had built careers based on competence, innovation and results, people who understood the value of expertise, and had no interest in the social hierarchies that had defined my life in Maplewood Heights. 18 months ago I began, my voice carrying clearly through the conference center's sophisticated sound system. I was living a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty from the inside. I had allowed myself to become invisible in my own marriage, diminished in my own home, and disconnected from the professional capabilities that had once defined me. I paused, scanning the audience of cybersecurity experts, government officials, and industry leaders. Today, I want to talk to you about resilience, not just in our cybersecurity systems, but in ourselves, about how the greatest threats to our professional lives often come not from external adversaries, but from our own willingness to accept diminished versions of who we're capable of being. The presentation that followed outlined Blackwood Global's expansion strategy, announced the new regional consortium, and detailed our plans for capability transfer and local training programs. But the heart of my message was simpler, that authentic success requires the courage to claim your full capabilities, regardless of who might prefer you to remain smaller. When I finished 45 minutes later, the standing ovation lasted for nearly 3 minutes. As I left the stage, Elena was waiting with a smile that spoke volumes about how far we'd both traveled from those early days when I'd been hiding my business activities from my own husband. The Singapore Minister of Defense wants to fast-track the consortium agreement, she reported, and we've already received preliminary interest from 6 additional countries that want to join the initiative. But the moment that truly completed the circle came later that evening. At the conference reception, I was discussing quantum encryption protocols with a group of researchers from MIT when my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Sophia, this is Veronica. I applied for 3 of the positions Elena sent me. I also wanted you to know that I finally understand what Marcus meant when he said he'd been married to someone he never really knew. Thank you for giving me a chance to start over. I hope someday I can do the same for someone else." I smiled, slipping my phone back into my purse, and returning my attention to the conversation about emerging cybersecurity threats. The woman who had once been my husband's mistress was beginning her own journey toward reclaiming her professional identity, and that felt like the most satisfying victory of all. As the reception continued around me, filled with conversations about innovation and collaboration and the future of international cybersecurity, I reflected on the strange path that had brought me to this moment. Marcus's surprise divorce papers had been intended as an ending, the conclusion of a marriage that no longer served his purposes. Instead, they had become a beginning, the first chapter in a story about what happens when someone finally stops accepting other people's limitations and starts writing their own definition of success. The surprise had indeed been mine, but it wasn't revenge or vindication or even justice. Though all of those had played their roles, the real surprise was the discovery that the life I'd thought I wanted, safe, predictable, built around someone else's dreams, had been nothing compared to the life I could create when I finally had the courage to dream my own dream. And those dreams, it turned out, were bigger than I'd ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.